Hello and welcome to Tigers by the Fire, a podcast out of Holy Cross High School about World War II discussions and stories. This is episode 7 of season 4, and this episode is called Baseball Goes to War. With me are Liam.
Hello.
Aiden.
Hi.
And Connor.
What's going on?
And in this episode, the guys are going to talk a little bit about baseball during World War II. And this is a topic that has a whole bunch of avenues they can go in. There's going to be some political stuff. There's going to be some firsthand accounts. There's going to be things about social issues. So it's kind of a breakaway from some of the really hard war stories that we've had in this season. And it gives us more of a humanitarian feel to it, which I think is really nice. And this was something that baseball normalized society during war. And I can actually remember my grandfather had one thing from the war that he had on display, and it was his company baseball that the entire company signed when they competed. So I'm going to turn it over to Connor, who's going to start us off, and baseball goes to war.
Well, as World War II engulfed the globe, it left an enduring mark on every aspect of life. So with World War II, humans in the U.S. we're going to need some sort of influence. And the influence from the game, from the players to the fans and to the very structure of the leagues, is very crucial to America. And many players traded their baseball gloves for military uniforms, leaving the spot to adapt to the challenges of wartime. And as baseball stars enlisted, legendary players like Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio, Bob Feller, and Hank Greenberg put their careers on hold to serve their country. As told, over 500 major leaguers and 2,000 minor league baseball players went to the armed forces. Their decisions not only affected their teams, but also had a significant impact on the morale of the nation. And for me, Bob Feller's personal story comes to mind. 2 months after the 1941 baseball season ended, one day after Pearl Harbor, Bob Feller joined the U.S. Navy. Now, I'm going to talk about how Bob Feller joined the U.S. Navy. This story came from my father, who told pretty much straight from Bob Feller's, point of view. So, on December 7th, 1941, Bob Feller was driving home to his Cleveland, was driving to Cleveland to renegotiate his MLB contract. And back then, they didn't have like planes and all that to where you can fly and all that. But he's basically just driving over there. And on the radio, he heard about the attack from FDR. And after getting over his disbelief, Bob pulled over at the first service station he saw. There he called the Cleveland Indians main office. He told them that he had a representative from any branch in the military to swear him in. He wanted to go and fight. So the following day, on December 8th, Bob was sworn into the U.S. Navy instead of signing his new MLB contract, which of course back then that was only thousands, and he went from thousands to hundreds. So you got to look at that as a huge sacrifice. Now, Bob Feller didn't have to join the military or get drafted because his father was terminally ill, so he could have been excused from any war or anything, but he said, nope, I want to join. So when asked by a reporter on why he still joined, he stated it was a war that had to be won. And like many other celebrities, the government wanted to use their popularity to sell war bonds and to stir up interest from the war effort. But Bob wouldn't have anything to do with that. After enlisting, Feller applied for gunnery school and requested for sea duty. Soon enough, he became the anti-aircraft gun captain of the USS Alabama, which you can actually go and see today. And that's Bob Feller's story.
I always find it pretty neat when you look at these guys who have, like, I guess, their whole life in front of them. Now, obviously, this isn't like modern day. Baseball players weren't paid millions of dollars unless you were Babe Ruth. They just weren't paid that much. But these guys do give up a very good living to go get shot at and put their lives in danger. I always find that to be kind of endearing. And you mentioned other guys like Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio. And so the Feller story, why was it significant to you, Connor? What kind of stood out about it?
Well, the fact that he didn't get drafted or anything to this war, he wanted to go fight. So instead of being pulled into this war, he pulled himself into this war, and he could have avoided this war with his terminally ill father, but he instead went to go fight for America and be American, in my opinion.
And the other neat thing that I think is kind of interesting, and you pointed out, all of these athletes can get put on like an OS tour or a war bonds tour to where they can be more performers to help entertain soldiers and improve morale, and that's important. We did a whole thing on Bob Hope a few years ago, and it's an equally important part of the war. But he obviously chose to, get into the Navy and get really into the Navy, serving on the Alabama. So that's a cool story.
Yeah, if I can just add, I think it's pretty interesting with this story. When I was reading over it, I saw a lot of similarities to like Captain America, for example, which I thought was pretty interesting with, obviously a person getting put on tour to sell war bonds when they actually enlisted to do something for the war, which I thought was really interesting when I was looking at the story.
Yeah, and the war bond tours it's like a big production, and they will take anybody who is a war celebrity or celebrities involved in the war to help sell those bonds, because that's what pays for a lot of the actual conflict. They're basically just savings bonds that you buy during a war. So, no, it's pretty good stuff. Now, I know you guys were going to kind of transition this to women in baseball, because made famous obviously by the movie A League of Their Own, and now I think there was a TV show. I can't remember, but so what do you guys have about that?
So for me, while many male players joined the armed forces, women stepped up to keep the spirit of baseball alive. Philip K. Wrigley, the owner of the Chicago Cubs, and that's why it's named Wrigley Field, came up with a plan to keep baseball alive during the war. To ensure baseball's future, Wrigley founded what would be known as the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League in 1943, or the AAGPBL, which is very hard to say. And it was born featuring talented female athletes who showcased their skills on the diamond. These women not only entertained, but also challenged sociality norms during the time of immense change. The league is now regarded as a significant figure in history of women's sports and a trailblazer in opening doors for female athletes into the professional sphere. Although there were minor regulation variations, the women's league played baseball in a manner that was comparable to that of men. The pitching distance and the size of the ball used in the league were marginally different. The overhand pitch was a novel addition made to the game by the league. Women's baseball was previously played underhand like you see as softball today, but the league switched to the overhand pitch to make the game more thrilling and difficult. And throughout its history, the women's league was well liked and drew sizable crowds to its matches. It basically replaced the MLB during World War II because let's be frank, there was no good MLB players at the time of war with all the stars leaving. And the league had a big impact on women's sports as well, since it gave women the chance to play professional sports and question pre-existing gender stereotypes. With all good things, they must come to an end, as the league eventually folded in 1954 because it found it difficult to retain its appeal as men returned from war. With the release of A League of Their Own, which I think all of y'all know what that is, the league received fresh interest in the 1990s. The league is now regarded as a significant figure in history of women's sports and a trailblazer in opening doors for female athletes in the professional sphere.
Yeah, at the Baseball Hall of Fame, they have a whole section on the women's league. And A League of Their Own was an interesting movie when it came out in the 90s. Obviously, you guys weren't born for a while, actually. Yeah. I was, I guess, like 5 or 6 when it came out. And I probably didn't see it till it was on television. But, I mean, it was like a really cool story. And it had, Tom Hanks stars in it, so it's obviously going to be pretty decent. And it really did, like you said, the idea of women, like female athletes, like today it's more common. Like we have the WNBA, you have professional female soccer players, softball at colleges especially is huge. But this was a big thing during the war that kind of kept people who were at home entertained. And sometimes that's really, that's almost equally as important is keeping people at home, living their lives and doing common things. So I always found that to be an interesting story. And it does collapse, obviously. Half the players, I want to say, left right as the war ended. And so they had a tough time getting stadiums. They had a tough time with money and everything else, which is a trouble that, women's sports still have today in multiple avenues. Yeah. So, Aiden, you're going to talk a little bit about integration with African Americans. All right.
Yeah. All right. So, up until this point, integration was not a new idea when we first entered the war, but the war provided new arguments and increased vigor to a movement that really began in the 1930s. When President Roosevelt emphasized the importance of baseball for all of America, he inadvertently helped the push for integration. Without the war, integration would have come, but it might have been another 15 or 20 years before it actually happened. When Jackie Robinson debuted for the Brooklyn Dodgers on April 15, 1947, this was the culmination of the efforts of many before and during the war. One of the earliest mentions of the idea of integration appeared in the Chicago Tribune in 1931. Columnist Westbrook Pegler asked the important question about baseball's status as America's national pastime. He wondered, how could this possibly be true as long as African Americans were kept out of white organized baseball? Pegler raised a question that would only grow in intensity and coverage during the 30s and 40s. Before World War II, a number of groups and individuals pushed for the integration of baseball. Near the top of the list stood the Communist Party, in fact, and in particular, its party newspapers and writers. The Daily Worker led the way with regular columns focusing on integration throughout American society, but particularly in baseball. Sports writer Lester Rodney championed baseball's integration, beginning with the headline in 1936, stating that fans wanted an end to segregation in the game. Rodney placed the burden on the fans to force owners to make a change. From 1936 to 1947, the Daily Worker continued its call for baseball to open its doors. Since baseball still reigned as America's national pastime, changing the face of the sport would change the landscape of America as a whole. And so, as we could see, the war really helped with the integration of the Negro Leagues, which would eventually lead to all players being allowed in MLB regardless of race.
Yeah, and one of the neat things, so you mentioned Jackie Robinson. So he is in the Army, I believe, during World War II, and he actually gets discharged for arguing, I want to say with a white officer, over seat placements. And you get a lot of these guys who come home from the war, veterans, African-American veterans, who want to strive for this, ending the color barrier. The other thing that's happening right at the same time, which is it correlating? And some people will ask this. They'll say, well, why is it important that baseball integrates after World War II? I mean, it's the first major thing to do it. It is the first national organization to really do this type of thing outside of a few unions. And then what follows within a year is the armed services is going to fully be integrated when Harry Truman decides to end segregation in the Army. And so that's these are stepping stones. These are big national organizations that are doing this. And obviously, Jackie Robinson playing for the Dodgers isn't going to stop Jim Crow laws in the South. That's going to be court cases. That's going to be laws that take place over the next 25 years. But this is a very visible step. It also helps that Jackie Robinson was also really good. And then, that was the other thing. The people who are coming in are going to be the best of the best, and they're specifically chosen to do that by the owners who do integrate, in particular the Dodgers.
Yeah, and I do think it's important to see that, like, a lot of these leagues, like the female league and the color league, it shows how the war had to have a creation of these leagues to sustain entertainment while a lot of the men were fighting, and then that led to progression through those things, like women getting more sports organizations through time, and then obviously segregation being ended in the MLB and other different things, which is very cool to see.
And just putting them at the forefront of pop culture. Mm-hmm. The other thing, this is also a microcosm, right? It's symbolic of the workforce as a whole, where, as you guys know, and as I think almost anyone who knows anything about World War II knows, the workforce is going to be comprised of women, a lot of women, and there's going to be African Americans working. And in fact, with FDR executive orders, African Americans have to be hired at wartime facilities. They can't discriminate on that. And there's some flaws with that program, but still, for the first time, you're going to see people who are getting out and that discrimination is not necessarily there, or at least the legal setting. And of course, when the war ends, they want to continue it. You can't just open that up and then have it end. And so I think that's a pretty interesting stuff. Now, you guys wanted to look at the Herb briefcase.
Yeah.
Right?
So Herb Briefcase Simpson is really a product of New Orleans and somebody that not a lot of people really know about. Okay. So his career blossomed with the minor league team, the Algier Giants, and his career took him as far as Washington and Hawaii, and eventually returning home at the end of his career. And Simpson became the first Negro League figure to earn induction into the New Orleans Professional Baseball Hall of Fame. And after nearly a decade of existence, the Hall, despite the region's rich heritage of African-American baseball, still hasn't enshrined a largely pre-integration local figure. So Simpson also helped break new ground in eastern Washington, where in 1952, the Spokane Indians, then a single-A Western International League franchise, signed Simpson as one of 5 African-American players on their spring training roster. It was in the minors that he acquired his nickname Briefcase. A sports writer once asked him if he was related to Harry Suitcase Simpson, who was around 6'5" to 6'4", another prominent Negro League player, and later a major leaguer. There is no relation, but because Herb was 5 feet 8 inches tall, the sports writer dubbed him Herb Briefcase Simpson. And as Simpson aged into his 90s, he became one of the last living links to Negro League baseball in Louisiana. He lived in Algiers after his playing days and continued to be active in several civic, religious, and humanitarian groups after his playing career. Herb played for the love of the game and enjoyed every minute of it, just like he enjoyed every minute of his life, said Ryan Wordy, historian for the Negro Leagues. In addition, he said, Herb was a gracious, humble man who served his community and became a local ambassador for the fading memories of the Negro League. He was not just a great baseball player, but a sports trailblazer.
So how did you guys, so he's a local guy, so Louisiana. So where did you guys find his story? How did you guys find that one?
Well, my dad met him, so that kind of helped. But I also read about him in a book, so that's how we got a lot of this information about him.
Do you remember what book you guys used?
What was the book called? Oh, I don't remember, but it was at the World War II Museum. I do remember that.
Okay. Yeah, we'll put it in the caption for the episode. So I always find it neat when you can get some local guys in there because it kind of personalizes the story. So that's really good. Now, let's see. We got Liam, who's going to talk to us about something a little different, right?
Yeah. So a lot of the stories that we've been going over have been specifically about players, about women in baseball, it's about African American leagues. So what I want to focus this into, I want to change that into the more broad scope of what exactly this helped and how it affected the nation as a whole. Because obviously these stories are interesting, but it's good to see what the leagues and what the playing of baseball did for the nation as a whole. So obviously, it did play a crucial role in the home front, and it was kind of used as a unifying force to provide some normalcy during the war and entertainment for people that were still on the home front. Because obviously, this isn't a time of happy, exciting games, but these players, these stories, and these games added to a almost depressing atmosphere to what was the home front during World War II. And a lot of these games were used as bond-raising I'm going to restart at that. Bond-raising exhibition games, which obviously help sell bonds and help the war effort. And it explores unique ways in which baseball connects communities across the nation.
Yeah.
And obviously, it's remained entertainment for years and years, and it did as the war progressed. And baseball was just a way to obviously divert feelings about the war and give people an outlet to, whether it be play, watch, or just listen to these games, because obviously they're over the radio. And the regular season of MLB went on, and there were obviously all these other leagues, and it really did help bring people together over something that wasn't the war, because obviously people were together about the war.
They need distractions,
right?
Just like movies or theater. They need distractions, and athletics provided that.
Yep. So one interesting story about this is the Green Light Letter, which was a letter from President Franklin D. Roosevelt to Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis, asking if baseball should continue during the war. So FDR was a baseball fan, obviously. So whenever he received this letter, he said, quote, "I consider baseball a very good thing for the population during the war," which obviously shows that he was willing to green light the MLB, which is why it's called the Green Light Letter. He also said that, "I honestly feel it would be best for the country to keep baseball going." So this shows the importance that World War II baseball during World War II played in the morale of the nation. And that's even seen by the president himself, who greenlit baseball. Obviously, he could have said no, and it could have been very different. Maybe something else would have happened to keep people entertained, but he didn't, because he was a fan. And it shows how interesting this whole story is, and how even the government was involved in keeping baseball going to help strengthen the morale of the people.
Yeah, and I think that goes along with FDR as a whole, even in the 30s and the Depression, where with the New Deal, he's funding things like movies and theater and music. The idea of keeping the culture of the country alive, and how it can't just be war reports, death reports. There's got to be entertainment. I think there's something to that. And it's interesting that he does make an effort. Obviously, he's probably pretty busy. And he takes an effort to write to the commissioner and takes an effort. And he, just really to promote this stuff. And it is pretty neat, too, because the MLB will send some people over in like 43 and 44. They'll send people over for some of the OS tours, and they'll do exhibition games for the soldiers and stuff like that. So it's a pretty neat process.
Yeah, and I think it also kind of shows how different America was compared to other countries. Like, obviously, we weren't directly on the front like countries like France and Britain and Germany, but obviously they didn't have this sense of entertainment and unity when they're going through things like they were. So they weren't having their prime minister greenlight baseball or whatever, or soccer for them to play as much, which shows the difference between the American people's morale and the morale of people in Europe.
Yeah. And actually going back, the book that you guys used was When Baseball Went to War by Todd Anton and Bill Nolan. And so that was something we got in the research at the World War II Museum, which is good. And obviously, look, I mean, this is, like I said, it was a little lighthearted conversation. Not as, there's no talk of genocide here or anything crazy.
Thankfully.
And I think I needed that after recording all the episodes. But I'm glad you guys did this. I'll give each of you kind of a little like final thing to say. Why do you think baseball was important during this time? What did you get out of doing the research? So we'll start. Who wants to start off?
I'll start it off.
All right, Connor.
So, I mean, obviously, as I've seen, my father, his name's Jason Lasad, he really gave the impact of baseball in my life, and everything he's taught me through stories and through just morale during that time in World War II, it really helps me persevere in life today for me to, to overcome things and to become a stronger person. So it's not just about baseball, but it's about being different. It's about overcoming what's in your way. So that's for me what it is.
Yeah, so for me, it was kind of, I'm not the biggest baseball guy. I was more of a football, basketball guy. But really researching this and learning about people like Herb Bravekiss Simpson, who's from Louisiana, like a hometown hero, learning about that kind of got me interested in baseball and kind of got my, I'm now like watching MLB games, and I watched the playoffs last year because of this research.
Yeah, so I decided to take the broad aspect of this regarding the home front because I am also not too big on baseball. I really don't know much about the sport, which is why I didn't want to take too many of the personal stories because I feel like I wouldn't do them justice. So I decided to take the home front because I thought it would be interesting to see what this really did for the people during the war, because a lot of World War II is very dark and genocidal, which is not very fun to hear about. And you really, when you're going over World War II, you don't necessarily get the more lighthearted things that happen, and you don't get to see how the people were feeling. You just see the discrimination that they felt towards Japanese or the constant war industry moving. You don't see the games of baseball being played and how that affected the people. So I think that being able to research and cover the broad aspects of baseball on the home front really helped to see how it affected morale, apart from the negatives.
Yeah, and I think that those are all really good points. And when you look at stories like this, and like I said, you could look at movies in a very similar way. That you could argue that should we be wasting money making movies at this time? But every week, people were going to the movie theater and they'd watch those newsreels, and then they'd get entertained by a Disney movie or a drama movie or John Wayne, and that's just what people did. And the war wasn't fought in the United States. And so you had to keep those workers kind of happy, and having baseball, having other outlets, I think did that. Well, guys, very good job. Good research. I think it was a much needed topic to change the pace a little bit. So thank you. And thank you for listening. This was Tigers by the Fire, and we are out.